Welcome back, Meatballs. Glad to see you're all here once more. So today's topic is finally our first dive into the Destroyer cults, their origins, and I, your immortal host, will walk you through to help you understand how they were formed and what their deal is. This will be, to date, our most in-depth look at how these unstoppable killing machines function, what happens to their minds that makes one a destroyer, and the weapons each kind of destroyer uses to satisfy their hunger for blood. But first, a question needs to be asked. However, before we start today's episode, we have our first patrons! So big shout out and thank you to Voldasterian and Rayleigh AB for your support. If you want your name at the start of these videos, then feel free to drop me as little as $1 a month. Doing so, you will receive behind the scenes access to all the scripts, updates, HD's access to these thumbnails, voting on the next topic, and more. Now, with that out of the way, let's answer that question. So what exactly is a destroyer? A destroyer is the designation given to any one Necron that was either constructed as, or happens to be infected to become an unstoppable force. The history is somewhat obscure with very little actually known about how they came to be. Some say that they came out of the furnaces in their destructive forms. Others believe them to be the byproduct of their master's hatred of life, their command protocols subconsciously turning those around them into destroyers. Another is that it is a disease that can infect the mind of a Necron and others around them until they're all part of a cult. One last is the idea that the destroyers once originated as a literal cult of death during the time of flesh. The cult was obsessed with bloodshed and being the strongest. When the Necron tier became the Necron, Azagrod, the Nightbringer, had taken favor to these death cults and gifted them with the hatred of all life, shaping their new metal bodies to be the perfect murderous monsters. But this is all speculation, so then what goes on inside the mind of a destroyer? But we shall get to that in just a moment inside of a different section. Why do we go in depth about the weapons that they use to achieve their ultimate goal of ending life? The weapons used by these monsters vary from different types of ranged weapons to close-up hyperphase blades, with the ranged weapons typically favored by destroyers being the gauze cannons and amnetic guns. But what do those names mean, and what do they do? Well, amnetic weapons fire a devastating pulse of energy that forces a person's atoms apart, and gauze weaponry, which magnetically breaks down a victim to their base molecules and then rips them apart layer by layer, flaying them alive. Then there are the hyperphase blades favored by destroyers who like to be up close and personal for their kills. Hyperphase weapons should be self-explanatory. However, for the lot of you, I'll break it down into easy terms for your simple minds. A hyperphase weapon blinks in and out of reality at such a rapid speed that they glow, hence the name hyperphase. So with that description, you can imagine the devastating ability that these blades have. They can cut through even the thickest of armor, as if it was a knife through softened butter. But this isn't about the specific weapon types, so what versions of these powerful tools of war do the destroyers use? Locust destroyers are armed with gauze cannons, and these are forward-barreled, larger versions of the gauze flares that Necron warriors usually carry around. However, if you see a Locust destroyer carrying around a larger gauze destructor, then they are reclassified as a heavy destroyer. Locust heavy destroyers can either carry amnetic exterminators, or as mentioned before, the gauze destructor, while those that carry the hyperphase weapons are classified as Skorpek destroyers. Skorpeks are armed with hyperphase thrashers and the hyperphase reap blades. Thrashers are a pair of single blades attached to the Skorpek's arms, while the reap blade is a single massive glaive that's used by both hands. Both are favored by Skorpeks, but you'll typically see the thrashers more often as they allow the Skorpek destroyer to kill quicker. Now, there are also Lord variants of these two destroyer types, but I think this would be a more perfect moment to talk about the differences between the two and what other variants exist. There are 4 different variants of destroyer. As we discussed before, there are Locust and Skorpek, but there are also Ophidians and Hexmark. But now, what are the differences, you ask? Well, to start, other than their weaponry, the Locust destroyers have morphed their bodies into floating weapons platforms, with their legs replaced with the lower end of what looks like a canoptic spider, but rather than legs, they contain anti-grav jets that allow them to float off the ground. This makes it so that when they fire their massive weapons, they remain stationary and accurate. The Skorpeks, favoring quick melee attacks, use 3 large arachnid-like legs to propel themselves across the battlefield at rapid speeds. They are, in addition, much larger than other Necron. Then there are the Ophidians. Unlike Scorpek and Locust alike, these burrowing nightmares favor tunneling assaults and are armed with hyperphase threshers, and a second pair of arms tipped with sharp claws. They have altered their bodies beyond that of even the Locust, having replaced their legs with long, serpent-like whip coil bodies. These bodies are equipped with small anti-grav modules that allow them to float above the surface. On top of this, Ophidians have a personal pocket dimension that allows them to retreat to when under heavy fire. Then there is the Hexmark. These deadly hunters are once Deathmarks who have fallen to the Destroyer virus, and still conduct themselves to the oaths of the Deathmark. They have now changed their forms to follow that same general plan of the Thal'rakh Destroyer with insectoid legs, but are equipped with 6 arms, with each hand replaced with a small amnetic disintegrator pistol. Now before we move on, even nobles are not immune to this call of the Destroyer cult. When those in charge fall to the plague, their bodies change and morph to be larger and more powerful, the largest being the Scorpek Lord. These giant noble versions of the Scorpeks are armed with a massive flensing claw, a large genetic annihilator, and a hyperphase harvester, an even bigger, more deadly version of the hyperphase reap blades carried by their smaller subservient variants. And the Locust Lord stands out against the other Locusts for being armed with any number of weapons, from the common use Staff of Lights to the deadly Void Blades and even devastating War Scythes. Locust Lords can also be found holding on to Resurrection Orbs, which, as the name states, is an orb that can resurrect Necrons. I think I may need to do a specific video on the armaments of Necron, huh? Anyway, I think it's time to delve into the minds of the outcasts and explore what goes on inside of their heads. So we've explored the origins, their weapons, and the different types of Destroyer, but what goes inside of their head? Why do Destroyers hate all life, and does their history have anything to do with it? Well, to explain, there will be a little bit of speculation, so if you don't mind, please take any of this with a grain of salt. So what is happening inside of their noggins? Well, when one becomes infected, their mind becomes a scrambled mess. They begin to become more ruthless in battle. Instead of just using their weapons to fight, they go out of their way to brutalize their victim, chopping or shooting away at a corpse until it's nothing but ash. They develop a deep hatred of all biological life, wanting nothing more than to eradicate it all. And I do mean all life, from the largest of beasts to the smallest of bacteria. And this is where their bodies begin to change to their preferred form and to do combat with. Their bodies fuse with their weapons, hands turning into guns, arms into swords. Really depends on the method they prefer. And all of that is to say that they become ultimate killing machines. This includes boiling entire oceans until it's nothing but a wasteland, chopping away at stone and rock to get at any bacteria that may still live in their presence. When one becomes infected by the Destroyer virus, they begin to develop an irrational hatred of anything organic and alive. They either maintain or develop a new personality depending on their role before the infection had taken over. But that's not to say that they're like this all the time. When interacting with the nobles of their dynasty, they act blank. Not emotionless, but like they're holding something back. They look lost even, as if killing is the only thing that makes them feel something. This makes all those who interact with them feel wrong, and so they're classified as outcasts. As outcasts, the dynasty uses them as shock troops. They're the first to be sent on the battlefield and typically keep to themselves, either fighting in small packs or as lone wolves, their only focus on the enemy. That is, unless a Destroyer Lord is nearby, in which it is able to use its command protocols to coordinate the mass of Destroyers against a single target. If the Destroyers acting alone was scary, imagine the devastating power that they can have when they're being coordinated. And I suppose that's why I enjoy using them against my opponents. Bringing out the Dynasty's Harbingers of Destruction, it ends battles quicker, so I may focus my attentions on more important matters than the vermin trying to invade our territories. Now, I can't think of much else that is left up in the air, so I think it's time we part ways again, mortal. And now, Detritus, I think our time has once more come to an end. As stated in the last episode on the hierarchy of the Necrons, I have a Patreon where you can donate as little as $1 a month to get updates on these videos and all that junk that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, before I go, I would also like to ask for your feedback. I'm always looking for critique, and I read all the comments I get, even if I may not respond to them. Anyway, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you think I've earned it, and I bid ye farewell, vermin.